A lot of performance-oriented cars now have valved exhaust systems, which allows the computer to control a valve and open and close the valve at certain speeds or engine speeds to change the tone and the volume of the exhaust. And that's the case here on my Porsche Cayman GT4. In fact, all of the 4-liter 718 variations have this same setup. In this case, the valve is operated by a vacuum line. The issue here is that the programming for the closing and opening of the valve is too intrusive. In other words, when you're at idle and you start to pull away from a stop, the valves are open but very quickly close. I think it's somewhere in the low 2,000 RPM range, and they stay closed for too long. And it just kind of kills the experience of the amount of volume that I want out of the exhaust system. So today I'm going to show the collar mod that was discovered, where a collar can be placed on that plunger there, and I'll show the stock operation in a minute, and then we'll go through how the collars prevent the valves from closing. But the collar mod prevents that plunger from going down and allowing the valves to close. So the vacuum operation and the car's programming remains the same. It will attempt to close the valves by applying a vacuum pressure to close them, but it won't succeed because the collars will prevent this from closing the valve. So the 718 exhaust has 2 valves, one on each side. I've already finished the collar mod over here. Now the muffler's upside down, and I'll show how the vacuum lines attach here in just a second, but right there you can see the collar's in place. And based on the experience of putting that on, I thought I shoot a quick video with how it went and some tips for getting it right. So right here, what's on actually the top of the valve is the connection point for the vacuum line. Again, I've got the exhaust upside down here, but this ends up being the top of the muffler when installed. So that's the vacuum port right there, and the OEM setup is these, I guess, rubber or silicone type exhaust or vacuum lines that have a braided stainless steel over them, and they slip on there and get snugged on with a clamp. Again, one of these lines per side, and then they go to a T junction that sits right above the transmission, and there from that junction goes back as a single line back to the the vacuum system. There are a number of different materials available for these shaft collars. The ones I bought are 3/16 stainless, so should be quite corrosion resistant, but they have different materials. What's key is the size. There's one size that's needed to fit snugly on the valve's shaft there, and that's a 6mm 2-piece shaft collar. I bought mine from McMaster Car. If you're interested, the part number for the 3/16 stainless is 9652T14. They are a little pricey. I bought 4 of them. I'll tell you why in just a second, but for 4 of these, they're sold as one unit per package. The total to my door was $158, so not the cheapest option in the world, but peace of mind that corrosion shouldn't be an issue. But that 6mm size is critical to make sure it's a good fit. I went with 4, 2 on each side, if for no other reason than to just make sure the clamping force is as much as it can be. It's probably not necessary. 1 on each side is sufficient, should be sufficient, but I opted for 2 just to remove any doubt, because again, the computer and the vacuum system is going to try to pull this shaft down, and so by my logic, a little extra clamping force to resist that will just make it more durable and add to the preventing it from sliding up that shaft over time. Now the placement of the collars on the shaft obviously will have an impact on how much of the movement is retained. So you can do partial closure of the valves. Now what I've chosen to do here is no movement, meaning even when the vacuum pressure is applied, the valves are going to stay fully open. But you can put these collars as far up that shaft as you want, and that'll allow your choice of how much valve closure And you might just do trial and error and see what works best for you, but I know for me that I want the valves open all the time. Another benefit of buying a couple extra, and maybe they don't all have to be the 316 stainless, but another benefit of having a couple extra on hand is they can be used to make sure there's uniform spacing. In other words, if you're going to put the clamping collar halfway up the shaft there, if you had a couple extras or some other piece or device that will let you have the exact same spacing on both valves, you can use a couple extra collars to just stack them up and then put the one that's going to stay on top of that. That way you're getting exactly the same position on both sides, because I think it is important for the purpose of equal back pressure on the engine to make sure both side valves are opening and closing the same amount. Just a little bit more about the stock valve operation. So hopefully it's showing up on the camera okay. The valve only exists in one of the two pathways, and there you can see it in the open position, and that's by spring pressure. It's standard position to be open. One thing that I found is when I operated this manually, about 1 out of every 10 times the valve didn't come all the way, at least on the other side, the valve didn't come all the way back to close. It's sort of like it was binding a little bit. Not a big movement left to get it all the way seated, but before you do the collar mod, you may want to make sure that it's all the way open. And the way you know that is there's actually inside the exhaust pathway there's a little ridge that the valve flap sits on to stop it from opening anymore. So before you place your collars, make sure that's all the way open, lift it up, and that valve is sitting on the ridge. This is a pretty easy mod to do. It can be a little bit fiddly because you're working with small pieces in small spaces, but here's a quick overview of just a few things you'll need. Of course, the shaft collars themselves, that's one disassembled there, 2-piece with 2 screws, and here's what they look like in the packaging. An Allen wrench and a T10 star drive. I made myself this little cardboard template. I'll show that in use in a minute, but what happens is over here on the OEM valve plate here on the mounting plate, there are these screws that come out, and then also this lip here. And if you let the first collar or the collar you're working on slide down among those, you can get to it. It's just more difficult, just more obstructions in the way of your fingers trying to get everything positioned and your screwdriver to put things together. So this just keeps it up on top of that or above that area, lets you get the screws started and pull it out, and then it drops down into place. So the collars, the little lifter template, the couple devices you'll use to tighten the screws, and then I have a rag and some 50/50 water rubbing alcohol just to clean stuff. So that's it. Pretty straightforward, but let's jump into it here. At a couple different points through the installation process, I'll be doing some cleaning, including right here at the beginning. I'm going to use my 50/50 to just clean the whole area here, and particularly the shaft, just to make sure there's no oil or grease on it, so that the collars have maximum clamping force and that nothing is lost there, nothing is left behind that could allow it to slip. All right, with it cleaned up, I'm going to go ahead and use this little cardboard device I created here. And again, that'll let me get the first one started without it dropping down among the flange here, this raised edge and the screws. I'm going to leave it loose so that it can drop down and be seated against this mounting plate. And again, so that there's no action at all. That's the setup I'm choosing of this arm. But again, initially started up here on this cardboard just to make life a little easier. I should mention too that before I started this placement, I did use the rubbing alcohol to clean the collars themselves. Again, sort of focusing on the inside. I don't know that there'd be any grease from the manufacturer, but it doesn't hurt just to give it a quick wipe down with your cleaner. Same thing, so that you're maximizing the clamping force, not losing anything to any grease or debris that might be stuck in there. So quick wipe down, and we're ready to start putting them in place. I'm not blessed with the most steady hand, so I fumbled with it a little bit off camera, but I've got the first collar in place and the 2 screws loosely screwed in there. What I've found here working on the other side that I've finished is, out of the 2 screwdrivers that I have, the T10 star bit is a much better fit for applying torque to these screws. And so when you're up here lifted above this ridge, at least the tools I have, I can get my screwdriver with the T10 on it. Once it drops down, as I'll show you in a second, the ridge interferes. Again, you may have slimmer tools, be able to get the star drive in there, but at that point for me, I have to switch over to the Allen wrench. It does fine, but I can tell, again, based on the other side, that I can't get quite as much torque on it. I think it's more than enough, but it's not as snug in that screw to tighten it. I'll show you that in just a second, but the reason I have to use the Allen wrench is just for interference reasons. The skinny Allen wrench can clear this, whereas my screwdriver cannot. So got them loosely in place there. Move that out of the way, and now it's down, seated on the mounting plate. Again, you can mount these anywhere where you can get your screwdrivers to it along this shaft here. And if you want to see the total range of motion of this shaft, you can push on it and see how far it lowers in order to fully close the valves. But for me, I'm going to put it all the way down on the base plate. What I found is that in terms of getting to these 2 screws, once the collar is down on the mounting plate, is to straddle this attachment point here, and that lets me get to these. The second one, you'll be clear of it. If you do a second one like I'm going to do, stacking on top of that, you'll be clear of all that, but put your 2 screws on either side in order to tighten them down. In terms of making sure this is seated, again, make sure that's all the way up, and making sure this stays down, I just put a little downward pressure on it. I'm not pushing on the shaft at all. I'm pushing on the collar only as I begin to tighten it. And you can go ahead and fully tighten this lower one all the way with a little bit of downward pressure to make sure it doesn't try to lift up as you're clamping it on. What I'll say is that, unlike when they're in the packaging, where there is a completely snug fit between the 2 sides, when you tighten it here, and it's got a really good fit on the shaft itself, but the 2 halves of the clamp will not come all the way together, and there's nothing wrong with that, but there'll be a very small gap left. So my recommendation would be tighten these 2 screws evenly. Don't get it cockeyed. Bring one a quarter turn, bring the other a quarter turn, and as they start to fully snug up, make sure that the gaps left on the split of the collar there is as even as possible. Again, probably not necessary, it probably works just fine, but if you're OCD like me, you want that as even as possible. So now I'm going to use the Allen wrench and get this one fully secured, and we'll move on to the second one. You can see here when I'm doing the final tightening with the Allen wrench, the Allen wrench will get all the way inside of this mounting plate here, but as I said a minute ago, it's not the best fit for that screw head, so it'll let you get it pretty tight. Just don't strip out the top of that screw head. Again, that's one of the reasons I'm doing the second one. I don't have any concern about this one if it were on its own, but a little extra peace of mind to do a second one. And that second one has no interference issues. Okay, the first collar is in place, nice and snug, and you can see already with just one, I'm putting quite a bit of pressure downward on that. It's not budging one bit to show any signs that it's able to go down, to slide the shaft down into the valve. I don't think that the vacuum pressure that the system creates is particularly strong. I mean, it takes a little bit of force to manually operate this, overcome the spring pressure, but this is not a high pressure system, so that's why these collars work based on friction alone. Again, preventing that from sliding through the shaft collar. But first one's in place, and there you can see that hopefully it's showing up. The split is not, the two halves don't come all the way together, so really good contact, the 6mm on the shaft itself, but the two halves of the collar itself have just a tiny gap between the two of them, and as I mentioned, I like to have the two sides, that gap be as equal as possible. So first one is done, second one is a lot easier. Time to throw that one on and wrap this project up. Between the first and the second collar, if you're doing two collars, or even if you're done after one, it's a good time to give things another quick wipe down. I'm wearing gloves, but if you have your bare hands, you just want to get off any finger oils or whatever that may have been put back on that as you get ready to move on to the second one. Or again, final cleanup, just to, when you reinstall it, know everything is free from fingerprints. So quick wipe down, and the second one will be ready to go on. So I've cleaned the second collar and I've started to put it in place here. One thing I will recommend is, even though these collars appear to be very high quality, do give them a look. For one of the two that I installed on the other side, from, I assume, the milling process, there was just a tiny little bit of metal kind of flaked, still attached. I was able to just brush it off with my finger. Probably wouldn't interfere, but it did require knocking that little piece off to make it completely smooth. It was kind of in the center. There was just a little bit of residual metal flake left on, still attached, but barely. Again, brushed it off with no effort. But take a look at them, make sure everything is clean and clear. I am setting the second one on top of the first one at 90 degrees. There's really no logic for that. What I can tell you though is that, as you'd expect, the finished product of the installed one is completely smooth. So they're not offset at all. They're exactly lined up. And the reason I know that is because when I slide this past the split in the other one, it does not catch on it. It's completely effortless to slide across the top surface of that previous one. All right, there it is with the second collar in place and fully secured, all T10 star drive for that one. And as I said earlier in the video, I'm able to get, with the tools I have, quite a bit more torque on the top one with that tool and with it up above this little lip here. You don't want to go crazy. Same thing as down below. You don't want to strip out the screw heads, but I've got those pretty tight, and it's absolutely rock solid here, ready to go. As a final step, I wiped everything down, the shaft, even down here on the valve itself, the vacuum area, including the vacuum outlet. With this setup, the vacuum lines are put back in place just as they are from the factory. So again, what this is doing is when the computer signals to the vacuum system to pull vacuum pressure and attempt to close this valve, obviously with these collars in the way, this plunger shaft cannot slide down, and therefore the valve cannot open. It's permanently open with this configuration, but it doesn't throw any check engine code, because from the computer's perspective, it's reaching the target goals for vacuum pressure. If you just disconnected your vacuum lines, and you just left them hanging, and I know plugging them is a popular option as well, but if you just left them open-ended and disconnected, it's never going to achieve the vacuum pressure, and you may get a check engine error. In this case, with the collar mod here and the lines reinstalled just as they originally were, as far as the computer is concerned, the second it tried to create the vacuum pressure, it achieved the pressure it needs. It doesn't have any awareness that the valves themselves didn't move. So I'd say cheap mod, although the collars I picked were a little bit pricey, but relatively speaking, a cheap and quite easy mod to do. So next up, I'm going to put this back on the car. I have a Klein exhaust on the car now, and it's great. I like it a lot, but it's just not my personal preference. So I'm going back to the OEM muffler back box here and some over axle pipes, aftermarket over axle pipes. I'll shoot another video on that, but while I had this off, figured I'd do the clamp mod, shaft collar mod, while it was much easier to get to. One point of clarification on this collar mod project: it is definitely not necessary to have the exhaust off the car. Here it is up in the car, and it's a little bit of a tight squeeze in there, but you could definitely get a hand or two and an Allen wrench up in there and position the collar. So don't be afraid to take this project on thinking that you have to drop the muffler. It's absolutely doable with it still in place. I'll check them from time to time to make sure they're not loosening themselves, but these look pretty sturdy. I think this will be long lasting. So yeah, we'll see how it sounds in the next video, but pretty easy mod to do. So hope you found this useful. Thanks for watching and have a great day.